In just 7 seconds, a white police officer rushed forward and violently attacked a black woman right in the middle of the courtroom, unaware that she was the town's newly appointed police chief. As the truth came to light, the room fell silent. His face went pale, but it was too late. Who will justice stand with? Will he escape punishment like he has countless times before, or will this be the day the law finally speaks out? The Jefferson County Courthouse this morning was shrouded in an old atmosphere, not only because of the early winter winds creeping through the high window cracks, but also due to the palpable tension that filled the room. The old wooden benches, which had witnessed countless trials, were packed once again. Whispering murmurs echoed throughout as curious eyes were fixed on the black woman standing in the defendant's box. She was Maya Thompson, a social activist, a woman of unyielding strength who dared to stand up for justice in a town that was far from welcoming when it came to protests for equality. The courthouse doors suddenly swung open, and a tall figure stepped inside. Officer David Carter entered with confident strides, his face cold, as though he already held victory in his hands. The dark blue police uniform clung tightly to his muscular frame. The shiny badge on his chest reflected the overhead lights, a clear symbol of his authority. The whispers in the room quickly hushed. Some people hesitated. Others stole a quick glance before looking away, but everyone knew this was no ordinary trial. Maya stood tall. Her eyes, cold yet filled with pain, stared at the officer who had arrested her just days before. Faint bruises still marked her arm, remnants of the terrifying night when she was thrown to the ground without mercy. She couldn't forget that moment. The screams of the crowd surrounding her, the heavy knee of the officer pressing into her back while she hadn't fought back. And now she stood in this courtroom, not just fighting for herself, but for the hundreds of others who had suffered the same fate. David's eyes scanned the courtroom before settling on Maya. He curled his lips into a sneer, a brief flash of contempt on his face, as if he viewed this trial as nothing more than a play he had grown too familiar with. To him, Maya was just another troublemaker he had dealt with, a woman who thought she could defy the system, unaware that everything had already been decided for her. He slowly moved towards the witness stand, pulled out a chair, and sat down with a chilling nonchalance. The room grew heavy as the judge struck the gavel, signaling for silence. In that space, the only sounds were the rustling of papers from the lawyers and the soft tapping of a reporter's pen as they prepared to record the most significant moment of the trial. Outside, the sky was a dull gray, as if a storm was approaching. Though no one in the room noticed, they only knew that something was about to unfold, something even David Carter, with all his arrogance, could never have anticipated. The air in the courtroom felt suffocating, heavy with anticipation and tension that was impossible to ignore. Every single pair of eyes in the room was locked onto David Carter, who sat arrogantly in his chair, his body slouched with a smug expression on his face. His arms were crossed over his chest, and his gaze was fixed on Maya Thompson, who stood tall and resolute in the defendant's box. He looked at her as if she were nothing more than a cockroach, a disgusting, worthless creature daring to crawl onto his pristine desk. His eyes were filled with disdain, as though he had already decided her fate before the trial had even begun. He sneered, his voice barely above a whisper, but loud enough for only himself to hear. Do these scum really think they can win? Maya, however, remained unfazed. The coldness in her eyes betrayed none of the internal turmoil that may have been brewing within her. She had been through too much to let his words affect her. She was here not just for herself, but for every voice that had been silenced by people like him. For every person who had been mistreated, trampled upon, and crushed by a system designed to keep them down. And just as he was basking in his own self-righteous arrogance, something unexpected happened. Maya reached into her pocket and pulled out a small USB drive, her fingers moving with a calm precision that belied the storm she was about to unleash. She handed it to her lawyer, who took it without a word. The lawyer immediately inserted the USB into the courtroom's projector system, and within seconds, the screen above flickered to life. The first image that appeared wasn't of the neatly dressed David Carter that everyone knew today. Instead, it was of him in the midst of a chaotic night, his uniform disheveled, his face twisted in rage. The video that followed, captured from multiple angles, showed a different side of the officer the court had been led to believe was a hero. It was David Carter charging at Maya from behind, grabbing the protest sign from her hands with a brutal yank before slamming her to the ground, as if she were a wild animal, vulnerable and helpless. The camera zoomed in on his face as he pressed his knee into her back, the weight of his body suffocating her, as he leaned down to whisper in her ear. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he growled, his voice dripping with venom. "A drunken, filthy black woman asking for justice? Shut your mouth and stay down." The courtroom was still, utterly still, for what seemed like an eternity. There wasn't a sound to be heard. No rustling of paper, no coughs, no shifting in seats. The entire room was frozen in shock, the gravity of what they had just witnessed sinking in, a silence so thick it felt like it could swallow them whole. David blinked, his chest rising and falling rapidly, his breath heavy. A cold shiver ran down his spine. He felt his pulse racing in his throat, every beat louder than the last. The air was suddenly stifling, and his body felt as though it were slowly sinking into the ground. He could feel the room's eyes on him, eyes that no longer saw him as an officer, but as the monster he truly was. He realized with a sinking dread that he could never take this back. It was too late. Without thinking, he turned sharply to Judge Elizabeth Crawford, his face flushed with panic. His voice trembled as he tried and failed to maintain his composure. "Your Honor, this video is incomplete. It's not the full picture. It only shows part of the incident. She resisted arrest." His words spilled out in a frantic rush, but even to his own ears, they sounded hollow, desperate. No one in the room believed him anymore. Maya's lawyer stood up abruptly, his posture rigid, his voice sharp and unwavering like the edge of a blade. "So, you're telling the court that this video has been tampered with? Then explain why 3 separate cameras from 3 different angles clearly show you knocking her down, pressing your knee into her back, and using racial slurs to demean her. Why does your report make no mention of her resisting arrest? And tell us why." David slammed his hand down on the table, his knuckles white from the pressure. His eyes were wild now, every inch of him shaking with fury and fear. The rage in him boiled over as he shouted, "I don't need to explain anything. People like her always twist the truth. She's not innocent. They're nothing but scum. People like them don't deserve protection." His voice was full of venom, his face contorted in rage, but even as he spoke, he could feel the eyes of the entire room judging him. The power he thought he held, the control he once commanded, was slipping through his fingers. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Angry shouts filled the room, and several people stood up, slamming their hands on the table in outrage. A few individuals even pulled out their phones, recording the madness unfolding before them. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and in the midst of it all, Judge Crawford's voice cut through like a knife. "Silence. Officer Carter, you've just destroyed your career with your own words." David's body stiffened, and for the first time in his life, he felt a cold grip of real fear creeping through every fiber of his being. His gaze darted around the room, searching for support, but even his fellow officers, those who had once been his allies, avoided his gaze. They turned away, unable to stand by him as the walls of his empire crumbled. And amidst the chaos, in the back of the courtroom, one woman sat quietly, her gaze fixed on him. Her expression was impassive, her features unreadable, but the faintest glimmer of knowing flashed in her eyes. She had been waiting for this moment. She wasn't surprised. She wasn't shocked. She was simply watching him crumble. David Carter had just made the fatal mistake of pulling his own noose tight. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly understand, was that this was just the beginning of his nightmare. The storm had only begun to form, and soon it would consume him whole. The air in the courtroom had turned suffocating, as if time itself had frozen in place after the explosive confrontation. David Carter sat rigidly in the witness chair, his face a twisted mask of barely contained rage. His jaw clenched so tightly that it seemed as though his teeth might crack under the pressure. His hands, gripping the edge of the chair, were trembling, but not from fear, rather, from the volcanic fury boiling just beneath the surface. He could feel the blood pounding in his temples, his entire body on the edge of exploding. His chest heaved with each strained breath as his mind struggled to keep up with the turmoil tearing him apart. The truth he had always buried beneath layers of lies, was now standing before him, unyielding and unflinching. Maya Thompson, standing tall in the defendant's box, her eyes locked on him, was an image he couldn't escape. She was the one person he could not break, the one person who refused to bow down to the weight of his power. But there was something more in her eyes now. It wasn't fear, it wasn't submission. It was pure defiance, as if she were daring him to do his worst. And for the first time in his life, David Carter could feel the cold hands of panic creeping up his spine, the realization that he was losing control, losing everything. He could see the whispers in the room, the glances exchanged between the onlookers, those eyes that once saw him as the law now watching him with judgment and contempt. He had done it to himself, this catastrophic unraveling. He felt a wave of shame rising in his chest, but it was quickly replaced by a hot, uncontrolled surge of anger. And then, as if the floodgates of his fury had burst open, he could no longer contain himself. Like an animal cornered, desperate to defend his territory, David shot to his feet with such force that the chair behind him toppled to the ground with a loud crash. The gasps that followed seemed to echo through the silent room. Before anyone could react, David was charging toward Maya, his eyes wild, his movements erratic with rage. He reached her in a flash, grabbing the folder she was holding with a violent tug. Papers flew from the folder and scattered across the floor in every direction, but David didn't even flinch. His focus was on her, on making her feel small, powerless. He snarled, "Who the hell do you think you are?" His voice cracked with fury, his face a deep shade of crimson as he glared at her as though she were nothing more than a piece of dirt beneath his boots. Before anyone could even comprehend what was happening, David shoved Maya hard, sending her stumbling backwards. The force of his push was so brutal that she crashed into the edge of the defense table. The sickening sound of her body slamming against it filled the room with an almost deafening thud. The noise was so sharp, so sudden, that for a moment it felt like the entire world had stopped moving. Maya's breath caught in her throat, but she didn't let herself fall. She steadied herself, trying not to show weakness, trying not to let him see how much it hurt. The room had gone completely silent. No one dared to breathe, as if the very atmosphere itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. The tension was unbearable. Then, as if the world had snapped back into focus, the chaos erupted. A few people screamed in terror, their voices breaking the silence like glass shattering. A woman in the back of the room covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes wide in shock. A reporter scrambled to raise his camera, capturing every frantic moment as if his life depended on it. One of the officers who had been standing by started toward David, his hand reaching for his radio, but then froze in his tracks. He stood motionless, his eyes wide, unable to process what he had just witnessed. Maya's lawyer, on the other hand, didn't hesitate. He bolted forward, rushing to Maya's side, helping her regain her footing. But despite the shock, despite the pain from the impact, Maya's gaze remained fixed on David. Her eyes never wavered, and in them, there was no fear, only burning fury and a growing sense of clarity. She knew what this moment meant. She knew what it would cost David and what it would cost her to stand her ground. The violence he had just inflicted on her was no longer just an act of anger. It was a reckoning. The sound of Judge Crawford's gavel smashing against the wood table broke the chaos with a deafening crack. Her voice, usually firm and composed, now quivered with barely restrained fury. "Officer Carter, stop right now," she ordered, her tone icy and unwavering. She turned sharply to the two officers stationed at the back of the courtroom. "Get control of this situation. If he steps out of line again, I will have him removed from this room immediately." But it was already too late. David Carter was no longer the trusted officer. He was a man who had let rage consume him, a man who had just revealed the monster beneath the uniform. The room, once filled with respect and authority, now looked at him with a mix of contempt, fear, and disgust. The courtroom was in utter turmoil. Some shouted angrily, others banged their fists on the table in outrage, while a few pulled out their phones to document the madness. The air was thick with tension, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone in the room. And through it all, one woman sat watching quietly, her expression betraying nothing but her sharp, calculating gaze. She was seated at the back of the room, her hands folded neatly in her lap. To anyone else, she would have appeared calm, even detached, but inside, her mind was already racing. She had seen it. She had seen it all unfold in front of her eyes, and she knew what was coming next. The storm was far from over. She wasn't surprised. She wasn't shocked. She was waiting. David Carter had made the fatal mistake of revealing his true nature, and now the consequences would be far beyond his control. He had no idea what was coming for him, but she did. In just a few short hours, David Carter's fate would change forever, but not in the way he imagined. The courtroom was thick with tension, a suffocating atmosphere of anger and disbelief hanging in the air. Amidst the murmurs of outrage and the astonished stares of those watching, Vanessa Coleman sat quietly in the back row. She didn't speak a word, nor did she show any emotion, but her sharp eyes scanned every corner of the room, taking in every detail as if weighing each moment carefully. No one noticed her presence. No one realized that the poised black woman in the tailored gray suit, tall and composed with a calm face, was not just a passive observer. Vanessa remained still, her gaze fixed on David Carter, radiating a cold disdain. He had no idea, but every move he made, every word he spoke, had already been etched into her mind. The moment he had entered the courtroom, the way he looked at Maya as if she didn't deserve to exist, the smugness, the air of superiority, his belief that he held the power of life and death over others, only reinforced one thing for Vanessa. He was a festering wound in a system that she was about to excise. She didn't need anyone to explain the case to her. She already knew everything. She had seen the hidden videos, read the manipulated reports designed to conceal the truth, and listened to the blatant justifications from those who thought the law was just a tool to protect the powerful. And today, she was here to witness what she had already predicted, a cornered animal thrashing in desperation, unaware that its fate had been sealed long ago. David Carter had no idea who she was. He didn't notice the slight tilt of her head, the way she observed him like a hunter watching its prey caught in a trap. But he would. And in just a few hours, he would come to realize that today was not merely the day he was exposed before the court. Today would be the day he lost everything. David Carter stumbled out of the courthouse, his mind a chaotic storm, his fists clenched tightly as his breath came in heavy, ragged gasps. He could feel the heat of shame, frustration, and, most acutely, the overwhelming sense of losing control, a sensation he had never known before. He needed air, a moment to think, to regroup, to find a way to turn the tide before everything slipped completely out of his grasp. But as he marched through the narrow hallway of the courthouse, a sudden collision brought him to a halt. He spun around, eyes burning with frustration, ready to lash out at whoever had dared to cross his path. Standing before him was a black woman, tall and elegant in a sleek gray suit. Her gaze was calm but strikingly sharp. She didn't step back, didn't flinch, or show any sign of discomfort at being bumped into. Instead, she stood her ground, lightly adjusting her collar, her eyes meeting his with an air of evaluation and subtle disdain, the kind of gaze that instantly made David feel uncomfortable. He furrowed his brow, scanning her from head to toe, trying to figure out who this woman was. But she remained there, smiling enigmatically, a faint smile so subtle it was almost imperceptible, yet it carried such weight that it made David feel as though she knew something he didn't. "Watch where you're going," he snapped, his voice strained with irritation, trying to project the usual authority he carried. But something in his tone felt off, less certain than it usually did. Vanessa didn't respond. She merely tilted her head slightly, maintaining that same enigmatic smile, as if she were observing a wild animal on the brink of being chained, yet unaware of its fate. Her eyes seemed to pierce through him, but instead of anger or confrontation, she simply shook her head slightly, then took a deliberate step back, as if to indicate that she had no time to waste on someone like him. David felt a strange unease ripple through him. This woman wasn't afraid of him. In fact, she appeared oddly composed, almost as if she were a step ahead of him. But there was no time for him to dwell on it. He sneered, muttering a contemptuous grunt under his breath, and then turned to walk away. Vanessa watched his retreating figure, her smile fading completely as he disappeared down the hall. She said nothing, but in her mind, everything had already fallen into place. David Carter had no idea who he had just bumped into, and even less idea that in just a few hours, his life would change forever in a way he never imagined. That afternoon at Ridgewood City Hall, the fiery red glow of the sunset cast long shadows over the building where hundreds of people had gathered, intense anticipation awaiting an important announcement. Outside, reporters stood shoulder to shoulder, cameras flashing as powerful figures made their way in. Senior city officials occupied the front rows, their faces stern, while a group of police officers lingered at the back, casually chatting among themselves, seemingly indifferent to the event unfolding. David Carter entered with an air of indifference, hands shoved into his pockets, his gaze sweeping over the crowd with blatant boredom. He hadn't quite shaken off the frustration from earlier in the day, but he tried to push it out of his mind. To him, this press conference was nothing important, probably just a budget announcement, some dull policy the government was pushing, or yet another meaningless speech from the mayor. Whatever it was, it certainly didn't concern him. He dropped into one of the seats near the back of the hall, arms crossed over his chest, eyes lazily glancing up at the podium. Mayor Henry Vargas, a middle-aged man in a neatly buttoned charcoal suit, slowly made his way to the stage. He cleared his throat, looking down at the hundreds of people waiting below, his eyes betraying the gravity of the moment. David paid little attention, instead tilting his head and scanning the room. But at that moment, he felt a strange, cold shiver run down his spine. In the front row, there was a familiar figure, a woman in a sharp gray suit, her face calm but her gaze exuding authority. He blinked. Her? The woman he had bumped into in the courthouse hallway? Before he could process what was happening, Mayor Vargas began to speak. His voice rang out with gravity, making the entire room fall into absolute silence. Today marks a significant turning point for the city of Ridgewood. After months of searching and thorough evaluation, we are proud to announce a major change in the leadership of our city's police force. David furrowed his brow, a sense of discomfort creeping into his chest. The police force? He didn't recall anything being said about leadership changes. Could it be? And now, the mayor continued, I am honored to introduce the new police chief of Ridgewood, Vanessa Coleman. The room erupted in whispers, scattered applause, and astonished looks, but David heard none of it. He froze, feeling as if someone had just punched him in the gut. He snapped his head to look at the woman, and just as expected, Vanessa Coleman was standing up calmly, making her way toward the podium. David felt the world around him shift. In that moment, he realized he had made an irreversible mistake. The atmosphere in the hall felt as though it had been drained of air the moment Vanessa Coleman's name echoed through the room. Whispers rippled like a wave, cameras flashed incessantly, and a few people exchanged surprised glances. But in the midst of all the shocked faces, no one was more stunned than David Carter. He was frozen in his seat, his body rigid, his jaw clenched so tightly that his teeth ground against each other. His hands gripped the armrest of his chair, white-knuckled, as though they were the only things keeping him grounded in reality. He couldn't believe what he had just heard. No way. It couldn't be. How could she, someone he had brushed aside as insignificant earlier, become the new police chief? She was nothing, just a nameless face in the courtroom, someone he could have dismissed without a second thought. But now she was stepping up to the podium to claim a position of power over him. His heart pounded, a heavy, oppressive weight settling in his chest as he fought to keep his composure. It felt as though someone had just struck him with a blow so hard it knocked the breath from his lungs, making his entire world tilt off its axis. How could this be happening? He had never been told about a leadership change. No one had warned him that someone from outside the department would be taking over. He had no warning, no preparation. And now she stood there on the stage, calm and confident, while he sat in the audience, feeling as though his entire body was on fire, his mind racing with disbelief. David couldn't take his eyes off her. Vanessa Coleman, this woman who until today was nothing more than an unknown in his eyes, was now standing before him as his superior. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly where she stood, and her gaze swept the room as if she were assessing the crowd one by one. When her eyes landed on him, she paused for just a moment. It wasn't long, just long enough for him to register that she had caught his eye. And in that moment, her lips curled into a subtle, almost imperceptible smile, a smile David recognized immediately. It was cold. It was deliberate. It was a challenge. It was as if she were silently telling him, "You have no idea what you've just done." The realization hit him like a sledgehammer. David felt a rush of heat flood his face, his throat tightening as if he couldn't breathe. His hands instinctively clenched into fists, his fingers turning white from the strain. He wanted to get up, storm out of that room, throw something, anything, just to escape the suffocating feeling that was beginning to settle in. But he couldn't. He was stuck, trapped in this nightmare, forced to watch as Vanessa Coleman, the woman he had dismissed earlier as irrelevant, stepped into a position of power with the calm assurance of someone who had already won. The weight of it all bore down on him as he sat frozen in his seat, unable to move, unable to speak. Vanessa cleared her throat, her voice suddenly taking on an authoritative tone, deep and unyielding, a stark contrast to the unease that was radiating from David. "Thank you, Mayor Vargas. I am honored to take on this position, and I commit to ensuring that the Ridgewood Police Department will operate transparently, fairly, and without a place for abuse of power." David's stomach twisted as she spoke those words. He knew exactly who she was talking about, and for the first time in his entire career, he felt an overwhelming sense of dread, something he couldn't shake off. This was it. Everything he had ever known, the power, the control, was slipping through his fingers. Vanessa wasn't just a woman who had taken an office. She had taken his position, his sense of superiority. In that single moment, everything he thought he knew about his career, his power, and his future in the department came crashing down. She wasn't just the new chief, she was his undoing. His mind was spinning, but one thought kept cutting through the chaos. He had underestimated her. He had dismissed her as a mere obstacle, someone easily brushed aside. But now, standing before him, she wasn't just an obstacle, she was the reckoning. As she continued speaking, the words blurred in his ears. He couldn't focus on anything except the overwhelming truth settling in his chest. Vanessa Coleman was his new superior, and she would change everything. He felt a fire of real fear starting to burn in his gut. For the first time in years, he had felt truly helpless. He had made a grave mistake, and now he had to live with the consequences. The door to the internal meeting room slammed shut behind David, the sound reverberating off the walls, leaving the space heavy with a suffocating tension that seemed to cling to the air. He was on the verge of exploding. The entire day had been a relentless parade of humiliations, from the disastrous trial earlier in the morning to the crushing sight of Vanessa Coleman stepping up to the podium as his new police chief. His mind was spinning, his anger bubbling over, but at least here, in this room, there were no cameras, no eyes watching, no judgment. This was his chance to confront her, to lay it all out, maybe even teach her a lesson she would never forget. David slammed both fists down on the table, the noise shattering the silence like a gunshot, making a few officers jump back in surprise. But Vanessa remained completely unmoved. She stood tall, her posture straight, arms crossed in front of her chest. The calmness in her demeanor was enough to ignite a firestorm inside him. Her eyes were locked on his, unwavering, assessing him with an unspoken challenge. "You don't belong here," David spat, his voice thick with rage, each word sharp and laced with venom like a cornered beast. "You don't understand how we do things here. You think you can waltz in, throw a few rules around, and turn this department into a joke about fairness and kindness? This isn't some bleeding heart organization you used to work at. This is Ridgewood." Vanessa slowly took a step forward, her gaze unwavering, as if she were studying him, dissecting him with nothing but cold, calculated focus. She didn't flinch, didn't step back, and certainly didn't show any fear. Instead, her voice came out as smooth and icy as steel. "No, David, you are the problem here." A tense silence hung in the air for a split second, the room holding its breath as if waiting for something to give. David snapped. In one furious motion, he lunged at Vanessa, moving with the speed of a wild animal, his hands seizing the collar of her shirt and pulling her sharply toward him. "You think you can talk to me like that?" he growled, his breath coming in ragged bursts, fury, frustration, and wounded pride flooding his every word. His anger twisted into something primal, something uncontrollable, and the room seemed to shrink around them. The sound of his voice reverberated against the walls like a crack of thunder in a storm. The officers around the room tensed, some instinctively reaching toward their weapons, but none dared to step forward. They had seen David's anger before, had witnessed his violence, But this was something different. Never had he been reckless enough to attack someone above him. Never had he dared to cross that line. But Vanessa didn't flinch. She didn't step back. She didn't plead or panic like he expected her to. Instead, she smiled, a smile so small, so faint, yet so sharp that it pierced through his fury. It was a smile of calculated defiance, a silent message that spoke louder than words ever could. You have no idea who you're dealing with. David felt his blood boil. His grip on her collar tightened, his knuckles turning white from the force. He was so consumed by rage that he didn't even notice the way his chest heaved with every breath, his vision clouded with anger. But before he could react, Vanessa twisted his wrist, freeing herself from his hold with a fluid, effortless motion that caught him completely off guard. In a blink of an eye, she spun around and landed a solid punch straight into his chest, sending him stumbling backward 3 steps. The force of it was so unexpected, so precise, that he didn't even have time to brace himself. The room fell into stunned silence. David stood there gasping, eyes wide in disbelief. He couldn't believe she had just struck him. His pride was reeling, his mind trying to process what had just happened. He had always been the one in control, the one who pushed people around. Never had someone dared to fight back like this. Vanessa didn't pause. She didn't even flinch. She took a step forward, her gaze cutting through him like a blade, her eyes colder than ice, as if she were ready to finish what she had started. Now listen closely, Carter. Her voice was low, devoid of any hint of mercy. I don't need to learn how you and your friends have been doing this. Your way has been rotten for years. I'm here to change all of that. And if you don't like it, you can leave. Right now. David staggered backward, his mind racing, but he managed to force a sneer, trying desperately to hide the rush of humiliation flooding through him. You think you've won, huh? Just because you've got a title and a speech in front of some clapping fools? I'll make you regret stepping foot in this place. Vanessa's eyes narrowed as she tilted her head slightly, her gaze still locked on him with unyielding precision. I haven't won just because I've got this chair, Carter. She took another step closer. I've won because I know how to clean out the filth from this system. And trust me when I say, I've been watching you for a long time. The room was deafeningly silent. The officers standing around bit their tongues, afraid to speak, unsure of how to react. They didn't want to get caught in the middle of this confrontation. They didn't want to face David Carter, but they also didn't dare oppose Vanessa Coleman, the woman who had just proven she wasn't a leader to be taken lightly. David took a step back, his chest heaving with every breath, but in his eyes, the flames of rage were still burning bright. He couldn't lose. He couldn't lose to a woman. But deep inside, for the first time in his life, he felt real fear. Fear of what she was capable of. Fear that his reign of control over everyone around him was over. And fear that he had underestimated the woman who was about to turn his world upside down. Less than 24 hours after taking office as police chief, Vanessa Coleman wasted no time. She launched a massive internal investigation targeting officers implicated in abuse of power, excessive use of force, and the mutual cover-ups within the Ridgewood Police Department. The announcement was made early the next morning. Every officer, regardless of rank, would undergo a thorough review. Old files were turned over, reports that had been altered were dug up, and allegations that had been buried were brought to light. This was no longer a threat, it was a purge. David Carter, upon hearing the news in the meeting room that morning, slammed his hand down on the table, his face flushed with rage. Who the hell does she think she is? Some woman who just dropped in here and now thinks she can teach us how to do our jobs? He snarled across the room full of junior officers, his voice dripping with bitterness. The humiliation from last night was still fresh in his chest, his every breath filled with anger. A few officers sitting nearby remained silent, not daring to meet his gaze. But some, particularly those with ties to the abuse of power, started to feel real fear. We can't let this go on, Mark Henson, an older lieutenant and David's longtime ally, muttered, his eyes filled with doubt. If she brings everything to light, we're finished. David narrowed his eyes, his hands clenched so tight his knuckles turned white. He knew exactly what he had done over the years, from brutalizing black suspects without cause to making arrangements to cover up his colleagues' misconduct. He knew that if the truth was exposed, it wouldn't just cost him his badge, it could land him in prison. We're not going to let her do this, he said slowly, his voice more dangerous than ever. I don't care how much she wants to play the transparency game, but I swear to you all, she won't win. The loyalists nodded in agreement, their eyes filled with worry but also determination. If Vanessa wanted a war, they would show her the price of messing with a hornet's nest like this. But what David didn't know was that Vanessa had already anticipated all of this. She wasn't naive. She knew she was walking into a battlefield filled with people like him, people ready to play dirty to protect the corrupt system they relied on. But she wasn't afraid, because she knew that to change a rotten system, you first had to uproot the ones clinging to it. And Vanessa Coleman was ready for this fight. Vanessa gripped the stack of documents tightly in her hands, the cold chill from the thin pages only amplifying the weight of the hidden truths within them. These reports should have been reviewed years ago, but instead, they had been shoved into dark drawers, covered up by those in power, and protected by those willing to do anything to shield each other from the consequences. She flipped through each page slowly, her eyes scanning every line, every number, every testimony that had been deliberately ignored. Everything pointed to one familiar name, David Carter. She read about an assault that took place 3 years ago, where a man was brutally beaten in the middle of the street just for asking why he was being stopped. He was detained overnight, but David's report simply stated that the subject threatened an officer. There were no witnesses, no surveillance footage. Everything had disappeared. It had been handled so neatly, as if nothing had ever happened. The soft sound of a knock on the door broke her concentration. Vanessa looked up, narrowing her eyes when she saw Jake Miller, one of the young officers who had only recently been hired by the police department. He stood there silently, his expression a mix of anxiety and resolve. At first glance, he seemed to be struggling internally, but then he walked in, closed the door behind him, and glanced down the hallway one more time before pulling a thick folder from his jacket pocket. He set it down on the table in front of Vanessa, his voice low but sharp. I can't stay silent anymore. Vanessa stared at him for a few seconds before quietly opening the folder. Inside were documents she knew for certain weren't part of the official system. Reports that had never been entered into the records, citizen complaints that had never been investigated, photographs that had been deleted from the system but had been saved by someone. They all had one thing in common. They pointed the finger at David Carter. Jake swallowed hard, his fist clenching. We've stayed silent for too long. Vanessa leaned back in her chair, her icy gaze sweeping over the files once more. She had anticipated this, but seeing the full extent of this disgusting cover-up still made her anger flare up. She tapped her fingers lightly on the table, then slowly nodded. The storm that David Carter feared was only just beginning. Less than an hour later, the urgent meeting was called. The conference room was packed, every seat filled by officers of all ranks, from the seasoned lieutenants who had served for years to the fresh recruits still in their probationary period. Everyone knew this wasn't just any meeting. The atmosphere was so thick with tension that it felt as though even the slightest movement could trigger an explosion. Vanessa stood at the center of the room, positioned before the file she had just received from Jake Miller. She didn't need grand speeches or empty promises. She only needed the truth, and today, the truth would be brought into the light, no matter how many people would try to bury it. With calm determination, she placed her hands on the stack of documents, allowing her gaze to sweep across the room. Her voice rang out, steady and commanding, filling every corner of the room. I've reviewed a series of reports detailing abuses of power within our department, and I want every one of you to pay close attention. She threw the pages down onto the table with force, the sound cutting through the heavy silence. The papers opened up to reveal damning evidence for all to see. David Carter, sitting in the far corner of the room, felt his heart race as the reports slowly began to reveal his name. His face flushed bright red, his jaw tightening as he clenched his teeth. This was it, the moment he'd been dreading. His entire past, every dark action he had hidden, was now on display in front of everyone. He glanced quickly around the room, searching for allies, but this time, no one met his eyes. No one stood to support him. Vanessa didn't give him the chance to interrupt or hide behind his usual bravado. She slammed her hand on the table again, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. For years, these actions have been buried. People who should have been protected have been beaten, humiliated, and discarded, all to protect the power of corrupt officers. Her gaze swept over the officers sitting in the room, some of whom were now looking at the ground, unable to meet her eyes. But that ends now. Today, we will shine a light on this filth. David could feel the heat rising in his chest. His temper, always on a hair trigger, finally exploded. He stood abruptly, slamming his hand down on the table with such force that the sound echoed through the room. What the hell do you think you're doing? You think you can come in here and destroy everything with a few damn papers? Are you out of your mind? His voice rang out, filled with anger and disbelief, but also fear. He could feel his grip on everything slipping away. He looked around at the officers who had once respected him, his mind reeling with the reality that they weren't backing him up. They were silently watching the truth unfold. Vanessa didn't flinch. She stood tall, unwavering. Her eyes met his, cold and calculating, as if she had already seen this moment coming from a mile away. No, Carter, you're the one who's destroyed everything. You did this to yourself. Without hesitation, she turned to the internal affairs captain, a man who had sat silently at the back of the room, observing everything. I'm ordering an immediate suspension for David Carter, effective immediately. The room fell into a deathly silence. David's eyes widened in disbelief. His body was shaking, not from fear, but from the raw, unfiltered rage coursing through him. This wasn't just a warning. This was it. He had lost everything. His hands gripped the edge of the table, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he tried to process the words he had just heard. What? What do you mean suspended? You can't. The internal affairs captain, an older man who had always kept his distance from the drama that had unfolded within the department, nodded slowly, his face betraying nothing. The suspension is immediate. There's nothing more to discuss. David stood there stunned, his mind scrambling to find a way out of this. He turned his head, eyes darting around the room, looking for someone, anyone, to defend him. But no one spoke up. No one came to his side. The officers who had once followed his lead, who had stood behind him without question, now avoided his gaze as if he were a stranger. They had turned their backs on him, leaving him to face the consequences of his own actions. The humiliation was unbearable. David felt like the walls were closing in around him. His breath grew heavy, and for the first time in his life, he realized that he had no power, no influence left. The same people he had once commanded now saw him as a pariah, a broken man. Vanessa stood across from him, her posture confident, unyielding, as if she had already won. She didn't show any hint of satisfaction, but her gaze held a sharp edge that said everything. She wasn't here for petty revenge. She was here to dismantle the system that had allowed someone like him to rise in the first place. The silence in the room was deafening. The officers exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what would happen next, but also too afraid to speak out. Vanessa had proven that she was no weak leader. She was here to cleanse the department. David staggered back, a sneer plastered across his face, but it was a sneer born of desperation. His pride was shattered, his future uncertain. He couldn't lose to her. He couldn't lose to a woman who had exposed everything he had tried so hard to bury. But deep inside, for the first time in his life, he felt the cold, biting edge of fear. Fear that he had underestimated her, and fear that his downfall had only just begun. Vanessa's gaze never left him. She had already taken the first step, and now she was going to finish what she started. The final trial took place in the Jefferson County courtroom, once again filled with palpable tension. But this time, David Carter's position had changed completely. No longer was he the arrogant officer sitting in the witness box, looking down on everyone. He now stood before the court, his wrinkled suit clinging to his frame, his face pale from the stress. The entire courtroom fell silent as the key video evidence was played. The footage showed David shoving Maya Thompson to the ground during the protest, his eyes filled with contempt as he pressed his knee into her back, his voice growling racial slurs. Another video displayed him mercilessly beating a young black man in a dark alley with no legitimate reason other than pure abuse of power. Each frame was a slap to the career David had once arrogantly believed was untouchable. David swallowed hard, his hands gripping the edge of the stand, trying to stay composed as the murmurs spread throughout the room. The eyes watching him no longer held any respect or fear, only disgust and outrage. He turned his head, searching for a familiar face, but even his former colleagues, those who once bowed to him, avoided his gaze. Judge Lisa Crawford slammed her gavel on the desk, demanding silence. She removed her glasses, her cold eyes locking onto David. "You have severely violated the use of force policy," she said, her voice carrying no hesitation. "The evidence presented in court today is crystal clear. Your abuse of power cannot be overlooked." David opened his mouth to protest, but for the first time in his life, he realized he had nothing to say. The judge leaned forward, her voice booming with finality like an irreversible sentence. "David Carter, you are hereby terminated immediately from the Ridgewood Police Department. Additionally, you will face criminal charges for assault and abuse of power." The courtroom erupted. Some members of the public clapped, others nodded in approval. But David heard nothing anymore. That statement landed on him like a death sentence. He spun toward his lawyer, but the man simply shook his head in helplessness. There was nothing left to save him. Everything had ended. David Carter lowered his gaze, his whole body trembling with shame, bitterness, and most of all, fear. He had lost, and this time, there was no way out. The atmosphere outside the Jefferson County Courthouse was boiling with intensity. Protesters lined both sides of the sidewalk, holding high placards demanding justice, chanting slogans that condemned police abuse of power. News cameras from major networks focused on the courthouse's main entrance, awaiting the moment when David Carter would step out, no longer a powerful officer, but a broken man, a criminal. David felt a sharp ache in his chest as he descended the courthouse steps, his eyes scanning the crowd that glared at him with contempt. The shouts of fury, the mocking stares, the words that no one had ever dared to speak to his face before, now echoed freely. He took a deep breath, but the air was thick, oppressive, suffocating. This feeling, he had never experienced it before. He had always been the hunter, never the prey. But today, he was the one being hunted, brought down in front of the entire world. The sound of high heels clicking steadily on the pavement made him flinch. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Vanessa Coleman. She stepped up beside him, standing silently for a moment, then tilted her head slightly, her calm eyes meeting his. Her voice was low and cold as ice. "You can change," she said, each word clear in the charged air. "Or you can let your pride destroy what's left of you." David didn't react immediately. He didn't shout, didn't throw a fit, didn't try to resist as he usually would, because he knew she was right. He had lost, not just in a small battle. He had lost completely, lost to justice, lost to his own arrogance. He had once believed he was invincible, that the world would always play by the rules he set. But now he was nothing more than an outcast, someone who had destroyed his own future with his own hands. David tightened his fist, but said nothing. He simply turned and walked away, blending into the crowd. No one stopped him. No one called out his name. He was no one anymore. Vanessa stood still, watching his figure fade into the distance. She didn't feel joy, nor did she take pleasure in his downfall. It was simply the end of a corrupt era. And now, she would continue her work to ensure that no one like David Carter would ever exist in this police force again. The sky over Ridgewood was clearer than ever, not because of the weather, but because a storm had passed. The police station stood tall in the heart of the city, but it no longer exuded the cold, distant aura it once had. For the first time in years, its doors were truly open to the community, no longer a fortress of fear, but a place meant to serve and protect in its truest sense. Vanessa Coleman stood on the steps, watching the new recruits enter. They were no longer the same faces devoid of emotion, filled with empty calculations. These officers were younger, more filled with integrity, carrying with them the hope of a police force that truly worked for the people, not against them. But she knew that to achieve this change, the cost had not been small. Every purge, every hearing, every corrupt officer removed. Each was a battle she had prepared to fight, no matter how difficult. Not everyone supported her. There were still those who hated her, those who silently opposed her from the shadows, waiting for an opportunity to bring her down. But she didn't care. She wasn't doing this to be liked. She was doing this because it was the right thing to do. Outside the police station, the Ridgewood community was changing. The citizens who had once feared the sight of a police badge were now daring to enter the station to report crimes, to seek help, to demand justice. For the first time in years, they began to believe that they would be heard. Jake Miller walked up beside her, his eyes gleaming with admiration. "We've come a long way," he said, his voice full of contemplation. But I guess there's still a lot of work left to do. Vanessa nodded slightly, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips, but it was a smile full of meaning. We're just getting started, Jake. She looked ahead at the city of Ridgewood, slowly reborn after years of darkness. There were still battles to fight, still people to protect. But the most important thing was that she had laid the first stone for a better future. A new chapter had begun, and this time, it would not be tainted by injustice. Night fell over Ridgewood, but in the darkness, the undercurrents had not ceased. Vanessa Coleman closed her briefcase, stretching after a long day. The battle against the old system was not an easy one, but tonight, she felt a sense of relief. At least things were heading in the right direction. The new officers were slowly adapting to the new rules, and the community was beginning to trust the police force again. But she knew the old scars wouldn't disappear easily. As she left her office, a small envelope was neatly placed on her desk. There was no return address, no indication of who had sent it. She paused, narrowing her eyes at it for a moment, then slowly opened it. Inside was just a folded piece of paper with a short but chilling message. You think you've won? The game has only just begun. A cold shiver ran down Vanessa's spine. She immediately scanned the office. There were no signs of forced entry, no one suspicious. But that only made it more dangerous. Someone was still watching her, still waiting. She clenched the paper in her hand, but instead of fear, her eyes grew sharper than ever. Fine, she muttered. Then let's continue. She knew the fight wasn't over. David Carter was just a pawn in a larger game, and the real forces lurking in the shadows had probably not yet revealed themselves. But if they thought she would back down because of an anonymous threat, they had misjudged her. Vanessa stepped out of the police station, the streetlights casting shadows that accentuated her determined figure. The story of Ridgewood was far from over, because justice was never a short-term battle. This was just the beginning. The battle against injustice doesn't only exist in courtrooms or on visible front lines. It exists in our everyday lives. When faced with injustice, you have two choices: stay silent and accept it, or stand up and make a change. While change can be difficult, even dangerous, silence is in itself a form of complicity with wrongdoings. Remember that justice doesn't always come immediately, but every small action contributes to making a difference. Don't be afraid to become a voice for what's right, even if you're just an ordinary person, because history is always written by those who dare to step out of their comfort zones and fight for what they believe is right. Thank you for joining us on this powerful journey. Stories like these are not just narratives. They reflect the struggles, the injustices, and the victories that shape our world. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think, feel, or question the world around you, then we invite you to be a part of our movement. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another compelling story. Your support helps us continue to shine a light on the truth, challenge injustice, and bring awareness to the voices that need to be heard. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this message. The fight for justice, equality, and integrity doesn't end here. It continues with every conversation, every decision, and every stand we take together. Thank you for watching. Stay strong, stay aware, and most importantly, stay engaged. We'll see you in the next story.